Repeat that. The Arab millionaire said in Arabic, his voice low, amused, certain no one else in the room could understand him. And for a brief moment, the entire restaurant continued as if nothing had happened. Glasses clinking, soft jazz playing, waiters moving between tables with practiced ease, and Emily Carter stood there holding a polished glass of water, her posture straight, her expression calm, as if those words had never reached her ears, as if she were just another invisible server. In a pressed white shirt and black apron, unnoticed, unimportant, ordinary, but her fingers tightened slightly around the glass, just enough to betray that she had heard every word, every tone, every quiet insult hidden beneath fluent Arabic spoken too confidently in a place where no one was expected to respond. Across the table sat Omar Al-Hassan, a man whose name carried weight in rooms far more powerful than this one, a man accustomed to control, to influence, to the subtle art of saying one thing while meaning another, his tailored suit sharp, his watch catching the dim light with quiet authority, and beside him, a potential business partner leaned forward, unaware that the conversation had just shifted into a language he did not speak, unaware that the balance of the deal was being rewritten in real time. And Emily saw it all without looking directly at them. She moved like she always did, steady, precise, invisible by design, setting down the glass, adjusting a fork by half an inch, her eyes lowered just enough to avoid attention. Because attention was dangerous, attention meant questions, and questions meant answers she had spent years learning how not to give. But still, the words echoed in her mind, clear, undeniable, calculated. He was changing numbers, softening commitments, reshaping promises in a language he believed gave him privacy. And for a moment, Emily said nothing. She simply stepped back, letting the silence settle around her like a shield, because silence had always been safer. Silence kept her job, kept her life simple, kept her past exactly where it belonged, unseen, untouched, and yet something in the tone of his voice lingered, not just confidence, but assumption, the kind that came from never being questioned, from believing that power itself was a language no one else could speak. And Emily felt it then, not anger, not even frustration, but something quieter, sharper, a recognition. She had heard voices like his before, in rooms far more guarded, in conversations that mattered far more than a dinner table negotiation, and she knew exactly how this would end if no one intervened. The partner would sign, the terms would shift, and Omar would walk away exactly as he intended, untouched, unquestioned. And still, Emily did not speak. Not yet. She turned slightly, reaching for the wine bottle at the service station, her movements smooth, controlled, as if nothing had changed. But her eyes, just for a fraction of a second, lifted, meeting Omar's reflection in the polished surface of a nearby glass. And something unspoken passed between them, something he couldn't quite place. Not recognition, not yet, but enough to make him pause mid-sentence, just briefly, just enough to break the rhythm of his confidence. And then he continued, dismissing the moment as nothing, because to him, it was nothing. She was nothing, just a waitress, just background, just another quiet figure moving through a world that belonged to him. And Emily lowered her gaze again, her expression returning to neutral, her voice still silent. But inside, the decision was already forming, not out of impulse, not out of defiance, but out of something far more deliberate, because she understood something he didn't, something he had never needed to learn, that the most powerful words were not the ones spoken first, but the ones spoken at exactly the right moment. And as she stepped back toward their table, the air around them felt different, thinner, as if something unseen was about to shift. And for the first time that evening, the control Omar believed he held so effortlessly began, quietly, to slip. Emily set the wine bottle down with careful precision, the glass catching a soft reflection of the table where the conversation continued in a language that still moved unnoticed through the room. And she stepped closer again, her presence quiet, but no longer invisible to herself. Because once you understand something, you cannot unhear it, you cannot pretend it is not there. And across the table the partner nodded slowly, pen resting just above the contract as if waiting for one final confirmation, one final reassurance that everything being said matched everything being written. And Omar leaned back slightly in his chair, confidence settling into his posture, his voice smooth as he continued. In Arabic, reshaping the final terms with subtle shifts, percentages adjusted, timelines extended, obligations softened just enough to favor him without raising suspicion, and Emily watched the moment stretch, watched the exact second where agreement would become commitment, and she felt the weight of it, not as pressure, but as clarity, because she had seen this pattern before, not in restaurants, not under dim chandeliers and soft music, but in rooms where every word carried consequences far beyond a single signature. And still, she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of discipline, because timing was everything. Speaking too early would sound like interruption. Speaking too late would mean it no longer mattered. And her hand moved almost automatically, refilling a glass that did not need refilling, buying herself seconds, measuring the rhythm of the conversation, the rise and fall of Omar's voice, the slight uncertainty in the partner's eyes that he could not quite explain. And then it happened. The pen touched the paper, just barely, just enough to begin, and Emily stepped forward, her voice calm, steady, and unmistakably clear. "Excuse me, sir, you may want to hear what he actually said." And the room did not stop all at once, but the table did. The motion paused, the pen lifted, and Omar's head turned slowly, not sharply, not angrily yet, but with a quiet curiosity that carried a hint of irritation beneath it, as if he were deciding whether this interruption deserved acknowledgement or dismissal. And for a brief moment, he chose dismissal, his lips parting to continue. But Emily did not move. She did not step back, and when she spoke again, it was not in English, it was not hesitant, it was not uncertain, it was Arabic, fluent, precise, and delivered with a calm that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway. And the words she repeated were not just translations, they were exact. Every inflection, every hidden implication, every subtle shift in meaning that had been carefully placed now laid bare in a language the partner could not understand but could feel in the sudden change of atmosphere. And Omar froze, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough that the rhythm of his breathing shifted, enough that the certainty in his posture faltered for the first time that evening. And Emily continued, not raising her voice, not rushing, simply finishing the sentence he had started, correcting it, clarifying it, exposing it with the same quiet tone she had used to offer water moments before. And when she stopped, the silence that followed was different from before. It was not background noise, it was presence, it was weight, it was realization settling into a space that had just been altered in a way no one at the table had expected. And the partner looked between them, confusion giving way to caution, the pen now resting fully above the page, instead of touching it. And Omar's eyes remained on Emily, searching, not for what she had said, but for who she was, because waitresses did not do this. Not here. Not like this. Not with that level of precision. And Emily met his gaze for just a second, long enough to confirm what he was beginning to understand, that this was not a mistake, not a guess, not luck. And then she lowered her eyes again, returning to stillness, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but the air had already changed, and both men at the table knew it, even if only one of them understood why. No one reached for their glass, no one moved the pen, and for a long second that felt longer than it should have, the entire table existed in a kind of suspended understanding that had not yet found its words. And Emily remained still, her hands lightly folded in front of her, her posture unchanged, as if what she had just done required no explanation, no defense, no acknowledgement. While the partner slowly leaned back in his chair, eyes shifting from Omar to the document and back again, trying to reconcile what he had just heard with what he had believed only moments ago. And Omar did not speak immediately, which in itself was unusual, because men like him were rarely silent unless they chose to be, and this silence did not feel chosen. It felt imposed, as if something had interrupted the natural flow of his control and left him standing just slightly outside of it. And when he finally did speak, it was in English, his voice measured, careful. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked. But the question was not directed at the partner, it was directed at Emily, and there was something different in his tone now. Not anger, not yet, but attention, focused and deliberate. And Emily did not rush to answer. She lifted her gaze just enough to meet his, calm, steady, and without any hint of challenge. "I am not implying anything, sir," she said quietly. "I am simply repeating what was said." And again, there was no accusation in her voice, only clarity, the kind that leaves no room for misunderstanding, and the partner glanced down at the contract again. The numbers now feeling heavier, less certain, as if they carried meanings he had not fully grasped before. "Could you?" he began, hesitating slightly. "Translate that again, but in English," and Emily nodded once, not as a gesture of compliance, but of acknowledgement, and she spoke, slowly, carefully, each sentence laid out in plain terms, removing the elegance of another language and replacing it with direct meaning, percentages stated clearly, conditions outlined without softness, obligations defined without ambiguity, and as she spoke, the gap between what had been presented and what had been intended became impossible to ignore, and the partner's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough, a subtle tightening around the eyes, a slight repositioning in his seat, the kind of reaction that comes when understanding replaces assumption, and Omar watched all of it, not interrupting, not correcting, simply observing, but the stillness in him had changed. It was no longer the stillness of control, it was the stillness of recalculation, and when Emily finished, she stepped back half a pace, returning the space to them as if it had never been hers to occupy. And for a moment, no one spoke again, until the partner placed the pen down completely, not on the paper, but beside it, a small movement that carried more weight than any argument. And Omar exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, before allowing a faint, controlled smile to return, the kind he had used at the beginning of the evening, but now it felt different, thinner, more deliberate. "It seems," he said, choosing his words with care, "that there has been a misunderstanding," and the partner did not immediately agree, did not immediately disagree. He simply looked at Emily once more, as if trying to understand how someone standing in a simple uniform, someone who had entered the moment without invitation, could have altered the entire direction of a negotiation with nothing more than a few sentences spoken at exactly the right time. And Emily lowered her gaze again, her role seemingly resumed, her presence once again quiet. But the shift had already happened, and everyone at the table knew it, even if only one of them fully understood how intentional it had been. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like a room adjusting to a new temperature, and Omar leaned forward slightly, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, as if grounding himself in something familiar, something controlled. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that same polished calm, but beneath it was something sharper, more deliberate. "You seem to understand more than your position requires," he said, his eyes fixed on Emily now, not dismissing her, not overlooking her, but studying her with a level of attention that had not been there before. And Emily did not immediately respond. She reached for the wine bottle again, refilling a glass that was already nearly full, her movements precise, unhurried, as if the question itself did not demand urgency. And when she finally spoke, her tone remained even. "Sometimes understanding is not about position, sir," she said softly. "It is about listening." And the simplicity of the answer seemed to linger longer than expected, because it did not challenge him directly. It did not confront him, but it did not submit either, and the partner shifted in his seat, clearing his throat slightly as he glanced again at the document. "Perhaps we should revisit the terms," he said, his voice cautious now, no longer carried by assumption, and Omar's gaze did not leave Emily, not yet, as if he were trying to place something just out of reach, a memory, a detail, a familiarity that did not belong in this setting. And then, almost imperceptibly, his expression changed, not visibly to most, but enough, a subtle narrowing of his eyes, a pause that stretched just slightly too long. And when he spoke again, it was quieter, more controlled. "Where did you learn Arabic?" he asked. And this time, the question was not casual, it was intentional, and Emily met his gaze for a fraction of a second before lowering it again. Her answer simple, contained. "I studied languages," she said, offering nothing more, no explanation, no elaboration, just enough to answer without revealing. And that was when it happened, not in words, not in actions, but in recognition, because Omar had heard that kind of restraint before, that kind of careful answer. In rooms where people did not reveal everything they knew, where information was currency and silence was strategy, and the realization did not arrive fully formed, it flickered, incomplete, but enough to shift something deeper, and he leaned back slightly, his posture no longer relaxed but recalibrated. Languages. He repeated, almost to himself, as if testing the word against a memory he could not yet fully access. And across the table, the partner closed the folder slowly, not with finality, but with intention. I think it would be best if we take some time to review everything again, he said, his tone polite but firm, and Omar nodded once, the agreement coming easier than it should have, because for the first time that evening, control was no longer about pushing forward, it was about holding back, and Emily stepped away then, quietly, as if her presence had always been temporary, as if the moment had never belonged to her in the first place, and she moved toward another table, another set of guests, another routine interaction, but the shift she had created remained behind, lingering in the space she had just left, and Omar watched her go, not openly, not obviously, but enough, his attention following her in small, controlled glances, trying to reconcile the image of a waitress with the precision of what he had just witnessed, because people did not accidentally speak like that. They did not accidentally understand like that. And as the noise of the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm, one thing remained unchanged, the quiet certainty that something about Emily Carter did not fit into the world she appeared to belong to. And for the first time in a long time, Omar Al-Hassan found himself not in control of the situation, but curious about it. Emily moved through the restaurant as if nothing had happened, her steps measured, her posture unchanged, her voice returning to its usual soft rhythm as she greeted another table, took another order, and carried another tray. But something inside her had already shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, just enough to remind her that moments like this were never truly small. Because once you step into a space where you are not expected, you leave a trace whether you intend to or not. And across the room, Omar remained seated, the contract now closed in front of him, untouched, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table as his attention drifted, not to the partner who had begun checking his phone, not to the quiet music returning to fill the space, but to her. And it was not the kind of attention he usually gave, not dismissive, not transactional, but deliberate, analytical, the kind he reserved for problems that did not immediately present themselves as problems, and Emily could feel it without looking. The subtle weight of observation that did not need direct eye contact to exist, and still, she did not react. She did not adjust her pace, did not acknowledge it, because acknowledgement would turn curiosity into engagement, and engagement would lead to questions she had no intention of answering. And yet, when she returned to their table to clear a glass that no one had touched, the air felt different again, quieter, more focused, and Omar spoke before she could step away, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier performance. You changed the outcome of that meeting, he said, not as a compliment, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact, and Emily paused just long enough to register the words, her hand steady as she lifted the glass. I clarified it. She replied simply, her tone neutral, leaving no room for interpretation beyond what had already been said, and Omar studied her for a moment, the silence stretching. Again, but this time it did not feel uncertain. It felt intentional, as if both of them understood that something was being measured, something unspoken, and then he leaned back slightly, his expression controlled but no longer distant. People do not usually interfere in conversations they are not part of, he said, and Emily placed the glass onto her tray, her movements unchanged. People usually do not notice when someone else does, she answered quietly, and there was no edge in her voice. No challenge, just truth. And for the first time, something close to a smile touched Omar's expression, not the practiced one he used in negotiations, but something smaller, more genuine, as if he recognized the precision in her response, and it lingered for only a second before it disappeared, replaced by focus. You have done this before, he said, not asking, not guessing, but stating, and Emily did not respond immediately. She adjusted the position of a fork, aligned it perfectly with the edge of the plate, buying herself a moment that looked like routine but felt like calculation. I have listened before, she said finally, And again, the answer revealed nothing and everything at the same time. And Omar exhaled slowly, the realization settling deeper now, not complete, but forming, because this was no longer about language, it was about intent, about timing, about the kind of awareness that could not be taught casually. And across the table, the partner stood, offering a polite handshake, signaling the end of a meeting that had shifted too far from its original path. And Omar stood as well, returning the gesture, but his attention remained divided. Part of him still anchored to the presence of the woman who had altered the trajectory of his carefully controlled conversation without raising her voice, without demanding attention, without needing recognition. And as the partner left, the space around the table opened, the tension dissolved, but the curiosity remained, steady, persistent. And as Emily turned to leave once more, Omar spoke again, this time with quiet certainty. "Emily," he said, using her name for the first time, and she stopped, just briefly, not turning fully. "Not yet. We are not finished," he added, not as a command, not as a demand, but as a recognition, and Emily stood there for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, her back still to him, her posture unchanged, before she continued walking, because some conversations do not begin when someone speaks, they begin when someone decides to wait. The evening moved forward, but not in the same way it had before, the rhythm of the restaurant returning on the surface while something quieter lingered beneath it. And Emily continued her shift with the same steady precision, taking orders, delivering plates, offering polite smiles that revealed nothing beyond what was expected. Yet every so often, she could feel it again, that subtle pull of attention from across the room. Not constant, not obvious, but present, controlled, intentional. And Omar remained seated longer than necessary, his table now cleared, his meeting concluded, yet he had not left, which was unusual for a man whose time was measured in minutes and outcomes. And instead, he watched, not openly, not in a way that would draw notice, but in fragments, in reflections off glass, in brief glances that carried more weight than direct observation ever could. And the longer he watched, the more the details refused to align, because everything about her outwardly suggested simplicity, routine, invisibility, yet nothing about what he had witnessed fit within that frame. And he had built his life on understanding inconsistencies, on following the quiet details others ignored. And this, whatever this was, did not belong where it appeared to be. And Emily, without looking, understood that the moment she had stepped in had not ended. It had only shifted, and now it was something else entirely, something slower, more deliberate. And when her shift neared its end, she moved toward the service station, placing her tray down with the same care she applied to everything else, removing her apron with a small, practiced motion, folding it neatly, as if closing a chapter no one else had noticed. And that was when Omar stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal intention. And he crossed the room with the same controlled presence he had carried all evening, each step measured, each movement quiet, until he reached the edge of the service area, stopping at a distance that respected the space but did not retreat from it. And for a moment, he said nothing, because sometimes the way a conversation begins matters more than the words themselves. And Emily sensed him before she turned. The shift in the air, the quiet stillness that follows someone who is used to being acknowledged without asking. And she faced him, her expression calm, unchanged, as if this moment had always been expected. "You stayed," she said simply, not as a question, not as a surprise, but as an observation. And Omar inclined his head slightly, a gesture that carried more respect than his earlier tone ever had. "So did you," he replied. And there was a pause, not empty, but measured, as if both of them understood that whatever came next would not follow the usual script. And then he spoke again, his voice quieter now, stripped of performance. "You knew exactly when to speak," he said, and Emily held his gaze for a brief second before answering. "Timing is part of understanding," she said, and again, the answer revealed nothing beyond what it needed to. And Omar studied her, not trying to dominate the moment, not trying to control it, but trying to understand it. And that alone was a shift he could not ignore, because understanding required something he was not used to offering so freely: patience. And Emily, without stepping forward, without stepping back, simply remained where she was, grounded, composed, and in that stillness, the distance between them no longer felt like hierarchy. It felt like something else entirely, something balanced, something uncertain. And Omar exhaled slowly, as if acknowledging a truth he could not yet fully articulate. "You were not just listening," he said. And this time, it was not a statement of curiosity, it was a recognition, and Emily's response came just as quietly, just as precise. "No," she said. "I was remembering." And the words settled between them with a weight that shifted the moment once again. Because remembering implied history, implied context, implied something that extended far beyond a single evening. And for the first time, Omar did not immediately respond, because whatever answer he had expected was no longer enough. And Emily did not offer anything more, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is leave a question unanswered. And as the quiet hum of the restaurant continued around them, the space between who they appeared to be and who they actually were began, slowly, to narrow. Omar did not move right away, and for a man who had built his entire life on decisive action, that hesitation carried more meaning than any immediate response could have, because remembering was not a word people used casually, not in his world, not in conversations that stayed on the surface, and he studied her again, not as a waitress now, not as someone passing through his evening, but as a variable that did not belong to any predictable pattern. "What are you remembering?" he asked, his voice steady, but quieter than before, and Emily did not answer immediately, her gaze shifting slightly past him, not avoiding, but choosing distance, as if the answer existed somewhere beyond the moment itself. And when she spoke, her tone remained even, controlled. "A conversation," she said, and the simplicity of it seemed almost intentional, as if she were offering only the edge of something much larger. And Omar's expression tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in focus, because fragments like that were never accidental. They were invitations or boundaries, and he had spent years learning how to tell the difference. "When?" he asked, and this time there was no assumption in his voice, no authority, just a question, and Emily looked back at him, her eyes steady. "3 years ago," she said, and something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, because time gave context, and context gave weight, and Omar felt it. The quiet pull of recognition beginning to take shape, not fully formed, but close enough to demand attention, and he searched his memory, not broadly, but precisely, filtering through meetings, negotiations, private discussions held in rooms where details mattered, and people were often forgotten once their purpose was served. And for a moment, nothing surfaced, just fragments, voices, agreements, languages blending into one another, until one detail lingered, something small, something he had not considered important at the time, a voice, calm, precise, translating without hesitation, correcting without interruption, and he looked at her again, more carefully now, as if seeing past the uniform, past the role, trying to align that memory with the person standing in front of him. "You were there," he said slowly, not as a question, but as realization forming in real time. And Emily did not react outwardly. She did not confirm it, did not deny it. She simply held his gaze for a second longer than before, and in that silence, the answer became clear without needing to be spoken. And Omar exhaled quietly, the shift inside him no longer subtle, because this was no longer about curiosity. It was about understanding how he had missed something that now felt impossible to ignore. "You translated a deal," he continued, his voice lower, more focused, "in Abu Dhabi." And Emily's expression did not change, but there was something in her stillness that acknowledged the accuracy of his memory. And for a brief moment, the space between them was no longer a restaurant, no longer a passing interaction, but a continuation of something that had started long before either of them had expected to meet again. And Omar's posture shifted slightly, not into authority, but into something closer to respect, because the realization settled fully now. She had not stepped into his world by accident. She had already been part of it, just not in a way he had noticed, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. Not because he lacked control, but because he had overlooked something that mattered. And Emily, as if sensing the shift had reached its natural point, reached for her bag, lifting it from the counter with the same quiet precision she applied to everything else. "Good night, Mr. El Hassan," she said, her voice calm, neutral, as if closing a conversation that had already said everything it needed to, and she turned to leave, not waiting for a response, not seeking one, because some realizations do not require acknowledgement, they require time, and Omar remained where he was, watching her walk away, not with urgency, not with command, but with a stillness that carried something new, something unfamiliar, the awareness that for the first time in a long time, he had not been the one who understood the room first, and as the door closed softly behind her, the echo of that realization lingered far longer than the sound itself. The door closed behind Emily with a soft, almost unnoticeable sound, but the absence she left behind was anything but small, and Omar remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze fixed on the space where she had just been, as if expecting something to resolve itself simply by waiting, but nothing did, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit, because in his world, things resolved, people responded, outcomes followed intention, and yet this, whatever this was, had moved beyond his control the moment she chose to walk away without looking back, and slowly, he returned to his table, his movements measured, deliberate, as if grounding himself in familiarity, but the contract in front of him no longer held the same weight, the numbers unchanged, the terms identical, yet everything about it felt different, because context had shifted, and once context changes, nothing remains exactly the same, and he sat down, his fingers resting lightly against the paper. But he did not open it. Instead, his mind moved elsewhere, not forward, not to the next meeting or the next decision, but backward, to a room 3 years ago, to a voice he had not bothered to remember at the time, calm, precise, translating without hesitation, correcting details with a quiet confidence that had made the deal smoother, cleaner, more efficient, and he had left that room thinking about the outcome, the numbers, the advantage gained, never once considering the person who had ensured it all held together, and now, standing in a completely different setting, that same precision had appeared again, not seeking recognition, not asking for acknowledgement, simply existing where it was needed, and then stepping away as if it belonged to no one. And Omar exhaled slowly, the realization settling deeper, not as surprise anymore, but as clarity, because this was not coincidence, not luck, not a moment of unexpected skill, it was consistency, intention, and something else he had not fully defined yet, something closer to principle, and he reached into his jacket, pulling out his phone, not to check messages, not to return calls, but to pause, his thumb hovering over the screen as if considering whether this was worth pursuing, and that hesitation, brief as it was, revealed something he was not used to feeling, uncertainty, not about her, but about himself, about how he had overlooked something so clearly present, and across the restaurant, the noise continued, conversations blending, glasses clinking, life moving forward without pause, and yet for him, the moment remained suspended, because understanding does not always arrive with noise, sometimes it arrives quietly, forcing you to reconsider what you thought you already knew, and he stood again, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with decision, leaving the table behind, leaving the contract where it was, because for the first time that evening, the most important thing was no longer on paper, and as he stepped outside, the night air met him with a calm that mirrored his own shift, the city lights steady, indifferent, and somewhere ahead, Emily had already disappeared into that same rhythm, into a world that did not revolve around him, did not wait for him, and that, more than anything, was what drew him forward, not control, not advantage, but the rare opportunity to understand something he had once dismissed too quickly, and as he moved down the sidewalk, his pace unhurried, his thoughts focused, one thing became clear in a way that left no room for doubt. This was not a conversation that had ended, it was one that had only just begun, and this time, he would not be the one speaking first. He found her 2 blocks away, not because he rushed, not because he searched frantically, but because he followed the only direction that made sense, forward, steady, without assumption, and there she was, walking along the sidewalk under the quiet glow of streetlights, her pace unhurried, her presence blending into the city as naturally as it had in the restaurant. And for a moment, Omar did not call out. He simply observed, not in the way he had earlier, analyzing, calculating, but in a way that felt unfamiliar, patient, as if understanding now required something different from him. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the authority it once had. "Emily," he said, and she stopped, not abruptly, not startled, just enough to acknowledge that she had heard him, and when she turned, her expression was the same as before, calm, composed, as if she had expected this moment without needing to anticipate it. "You followed," she said, not as a question, not as a challenge, just a simple recognition of what had happened, and Omar nodded slightly, closing the distance between them without urgency. "I had more to understand," he replied, and there was no performance in his tone, no attempt to control the direction of what came next, only honesty, measured and deliberate, and Emily studied him for a brief second, not judging, not evaluating, just seeing, and then she spoke. "Understanding does not come from asking more questions," she said quietly. "It comes from listening differently." And the words settled between them, simple, direct, and Omar exhaled softly, as if accepting something he had not been ready to consider before. "Then I listened wrong," he said, and it was not an admission of failure, but an acknowledgement of truth, and for the first time, Emily's expression shifted, not into a smile, not into approval, but into something softer, something that recognized the weight of that sentence, because it was not easy for someone like him to say it, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was balanced, shared, and after a moment, Omar reached into his jacket, pulling out a business card, holding it for a second as if considering whether the gesture still carried the same meaning it always had, before extending it toward her. "I would like to speak again," he said, and this time, it was not a command, not an expectation, but an offer, and Emily looked at the card, then back at him, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, and she did not take it immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, because some things should not be accepted too quickly, and when she finally did, her fingers brushed the edge of the card lightly, as if acknowledging the gesture rather than the object itself. "If I call," she said, her voice calm, "it will not be because of your position," and Omar nodded once, without hesitation. "I would not expect it to be," he replied, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke again, the city continuing around them, distant sounds, passing lights, life moving forward without pause, and yet within that moment, something had shifted fully, not in power, not in control, but in perspective, and Emily glanced down at the card once before slipping it into her bag, not as a promise, not as a commitment, but as a possibility, and she met his gaze one last time. "Good night, Mr. Al-Hassan," she said, and there was no distance in her tone, no hierarchy, just clarity, and as she turned to leave, Omar did not follow this time. He did not call out again, because he understood now that not every step forward required pursuit. Some required patience, and he remained where he was, watching her disappear into the rhythm of the city once more, but this time, the absence did not feel like loss. It felt like space, space for something to unfold naturally, without force, without assumption, and as he stood there, the quiet truth settled in, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that did not need repetition, that respect is not something you demand or negotiate. It is something you learn to recognize, often in the people you almost overlooked.